Gerald Ford, the 38th President of the United States, has died today. His wife, Betty, has just made that announcement. We're going to do a special report for the entire country, and so we're going to pause right now for a moment so the rest of the country can join us.
This is an ABC News special report.
Good evening. We're breaking into regular programming right now to tell you the news that Gerald R. Ford, the 38th President of the United States, died today at his home in California. His widow, Betty Ford, has made that announcement. President Ford was 93 years old. He died at home, surrounded by members of his family, including his wife of more than half a century, Betty Ford. President Ford was the longest living American president at 93 years old. There had been concerns about his health in the last few years. That is the last moving picture we've seen of him when President Bush visited him out in California. He was active until very near the end of his long life. Gerald Ford was President of the United States for just over 2 years, taking office after the resignation of President Nixon and the Watergate scandal. The country was traumatized and polarized in a way that even our politics did not begin to approach. Gerald Ford was a healer, eminently decent man, modest and honest. The country seemed to rally to his spirit, even though when he pardoned Richard Nixon, it was a source of great controversy and may have cost him re-election to the office of presidency. He was a member of the House of Representatives for 25 years and vice president, being named vice president by President Nixon after the resignation of Spiro Agnew. Gerald Ford is actually the only man ever to be president of the United States who wasn't elected either to be president or vice president. And he died today in California at the age of 93. We're going to talk a little bit about his legacy right now. We're joined on the phone right now by Richard Norton Smith, who is scholar in residence at George Mason University, former director of the Ford Library, and he is very close to the family. Richard Norton Smith, I know this is a difficult day for all those who love Gerald Ford, but what can you tell us about President Ford's last days?
Well, I think I'm probably going to leave that to the family, Terry. I'm sure the family spokesman will be putting out that information. My understanding is that the family was with the president when he passed away, that it was very peaceful. And, I'm struck, forgive the historian in me, history repeats itself. It was on December 26, 1973, that Harry Truman passed away in Kansas City. And there's a connection there. One of the very first things Gerald Ford did when he became president, one of the symbolic actions he took, was to put Harry Truman's portrait in the cabinet room of the White House. And that was one of many symbolic things he did during those first few days, really to let the American people know that a page had been turned, that things were going to be very, very different. And I think you are right. I think history will remember him in many ways for what he was able to do in terms of restoring confidence in our government, restoring integrity to the American presidency. But, that wasn't the whole story. Your theme is tonight on Nightline is Mavericks. Gerald Ford, it may surprise you, was something of a maverick himself politically. He began his political career taking on an entrenched Republican congressman in West Michigan over the issue of internationalism. He'd fought in World War II. He'd come back from the war convinced that the United States could no longer take shelter behind two oceans. And he took on an incumbent who believed that the world ended at the Michigan-Indiana line, and against all odds, he beat him.
And he was an internationalist throughout his congressional and presidential career. And as you say, Richard Norton Smith, he had a knack in those traumatized days after the resignation of President Nixon for the right gesture, the right words to bring the country to some sense of healing. Our long national nightmare is over, he said upon taking office. Let me go now to our colleague Charles Gibson. In addition to being our anchor here at World News, Charlie, covered the 1976 presidential campaign of Gerald Ford. Charlie, when you think about Gerald Ford, the man you knew and the man you covered, what comes to mind?
Well, I was interested to hear you talking just a moment ago, because the decency of the man was, above all, what struck you. A fascinating family. He was very much a family man. Some people may not remember that when he actually became president, he didn't move for a while out of his home in Arlington. The Ford family liked where they lived, actually out in Alexandria, Virginia, and they didn't want to come in. They didn't come into the White House for a while, and then there was a lot about the president making his own breakfast, etc. He was really, in many respects, the common man who ascended to the presidency, as you mentioned, somewhat by accident, the resignation of Spiro Agnew and then the resignation of Richard Nixon. But you mentioned the pardon of Nixon, and that obviously was one of the seminal moments of his presidency. I covered the election, and in many respects that was something that he never could overcome. He pardoned Richard Nixon because he said, as president, I'm spending a quarter of my time on the problems of one person. And he didn't really prepare, I don't think, the country for the pardon. He sort of did it quickly without laying much groundwork. It took the country by surprise. I remember, as a young reporter in those days, his approval ratings just plummeted. He had very high approval ratings when he first took over because he did say the right things in assuming the presidency. You mentioned, he said, my fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over. People don't remember, if they didn't live through that period, just how traumatizing Watergate was. And then he said, our Constitution works, here the people rule. And those words really were electric. Gave him a tremendously high approval rating. I think it was over 70%, and then he pardoned Nixon, and it plummeted to about 50% just overnight. And that really was something that people never forgave him for. They thought there was a quid pro quo. He said over and over that was not true, that he was never promised Nixon a pardon. When Nixon named him vice president, he testified to that effect, but people, it was just a difficult uphill climb for them. And then Jimmy Carter came along as a sort of fresh face in politics. People were ready for a change, having gone through the Nixon period, and Gerald Ford lost narrowly, but did lose the presidency in 1976.
And so he served only those 2 years, but as you said, he said our Constitution works, and if his contribution was to demonstrate that, that's, in those times, a mighty large contribution. We have a statement here by Mrs. Betty Ford. She says, my family joins me in sharing the difficult news that Gerald Ford, our beloved husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather, has passed away at 93 years of age. His life was filled with love of God, his family, and his country. Gerald Ford dying today in California at the age of 93.